Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to do something a little different. We're not going to talk about a hit show. We're not even going to talk about a classic. We're going to talk about a show that's, well, a cautionary tale. A show that tried to fly over the audience, but mostly just crashed into the headlines. We're talking about the one, the only, the most ridiculously expensive Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark. Really? I said turn off the dark, not the light. Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark is a musical with music and lyrics by Bono and The Edge of Irish rock band U2 and a book by 11-time Tony nominee Julie Taymor, Glenn Berger, and Robert Sarcasa. Now, based on the Marvel Comics character Spider-Man, the story incorporates elements of the 2002 film, the 2004 film, and the Greek myth of Arachne. It tells Spider-Man's origin story, his romance with Mary Jane Watson, and his battles with the Green Goblin. Now, before we can get any deeper into the chaos, let's take a step back for a minute. Now, you'd think the people behind a Spider-Man musical would have at least one thing in common with the comics. You know, like with great power comes great responsibility. Well, in this case, it was more like with an almost infinite budget comes an infinite number of problems. Although often described as a rock musical, the production treads new ground that some commentators have asserted have effectively distanced it from its peers and caused some confusion when it comes time to describe the show. Now, U2's David Evans, aka The Edge, said he was unsure how to describe the production, saying it had elements of rock and roll, circus, opera, and musical theater, while Paul Hewson, aka Bono, admitted that his description was a little pretentious, referring to it as a pop-up pop art opera, and said that the director, Julie Taymor, called it a rock and roll circus drama. And of course, ABC News broadcaster 60 Minutes called it a comic book rock opera circus. But in this segment, Bono noted that even using rock to describe the music is too narrow a description, because we've moved out of the rock and roll idiom in places into some very new territory for us, including big show tunes and dance songs. Okay, so you had these two rock icons, Bono and The Edge, from a band known for creating stadium-filling anthems attempting to create a musical for Broadway. But they didn't just write a few rock songs and call it a day. They were actively trying to push the boundaries of what a musical could be. When you have the creators themselves, along with major news outlets struggling to define the genre of the show, you're basically setting up a very high stakes and potentially very confusing situation. However, the production was described early on as the most technically complex show ever on Broadway, with 27 aerial sequences of characters flying and engaging in aerial combat. Now, the production also includes a multitude of moving set pieces that put the audience in the middle of the action, and enough projections onto giant screens that Bono has said that it's like a three-dimensional graphic novel. Now, the original story treated the origins of Spider-Man similarly to the story in the 2002 film, but they wove in an involved story about a villain based on the mythological Arachne. A Greek chorus of four teenagers narrated the story, and in the rewritten version, the plot hews closer to the comic book and film and trims and transforms the role of Arachne into a kindred spirit in Spider-Man's dreams. The vision for Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark was to be a technological and theatrical spectacle that redefined what a musical could be. It wasn't just a stage play, it was a live-action comic book, a circus, and a rock concert all in one. Now, the show's journey from the mythological Arachne to a plot that hewed closer to the comic book demonstrates a key part of this drama. They basically had to simplify the ambitious avant-garde storytelling to make the plot understandable to a mass theater audience. This creative struggle was playing out in real time during the longest preview period in Broadway history. So, in essence, the show's goal was to be an entirely new kind of musical, a pop-up, pop art opera. But in its attempt to get there, it had to constantly adjust, compromise, and essentially, well, find itself. Spider-Man Turn of the Dark had no out-of-town tryouts because of the technical requirements of the production. So, guys, for a traditional Broadway musical, an out-of-town tryout is a non-negotiable step. It's essentially a dry run into a smaller market like Boston or Chicago, where the creative team can test the show in front of a live audience. Well, in skipping this entire process meant that all of the issues that a typical show would work out quietly in a different city, meaning the script problems, the song changes, the dangerous technical glitches, were actually all being addressed in the harsh glare of Broadway's spotlight. Well, the production itself started as previews at the former Foxwoods Theater, now known as the Lyric Theater, in November of 2010, with their first opening night gala taking place in June of 2011. Now, wait a minute. You're probably asking, how does that even happen? Well, instead of an out of town tryout, the show had the longest and most public preview period in Broadway history. Now, previews are when a show is running in its final theater for paying audiences before its official opening night to the public. The show essentially tried to fix its many, many problems live in front of critics and the press, and with a multi-million-dollar budget ticking away. Now, the creative team originally included the director Taymor and the choreographer Daniel Ezralo, with scenic design by George Sipin, costume design by Aiko Ishioka, and lighting design by Donald Holder. Well, as if the drama didn't end there, once Taymor left the production, the creative team was expanded to include Philip McKinley joining as production consultant, additional choreography by Chase Brock, and an additional writing by Robert Sarkasa. Now let's back up a minute here. When Julie Taymor, the original visionary director, departed the production, it was actually a clear signal that the initial high concept approach was being abandoned in favor of something a little more commercially viable. Well, this led to a complete overhaul of the show, but one that was incredibly messy because it had to happen while the show was still running. It was no longer a single unified creative vision. It was now a committee trying to fix a runaway train. Now, the most significant consequence of Taymor's departure and the expansion of the creative team was the dramatic transformation of the show itself. It basically went from Taymor's version, which, with its mythological plot and Greek chorus, becoming a bold artistic statement, to the new team's mandate, which was to make the show a clear, coherent, and accessible story for a general audience. Well, the plot was simplified to more closely follow the familiar comic book narrative, and the theatrical quirks were actually toned down. The role of Arachne herself, once a central mythological figure, was reduced to a kindred spirit. This creative reshuffling essentially turned the production into an extended public lab experiment. The new creative team had to rewrite and restage large sections of the show while performing 8 shows a week. This resulted in a show with a dual identity, a Taymor era Act 1 and a drastically changed Act 2. So, Chris, where does this leave the cast? Well, the preview and the opening night cast starred Tony-winning musician and singer-songwriter Reeve Carney. And by the way, fun fact here, Reeve's band that he is part of is actually the band in real life, is actually the band that replaced traditional orchestras for a Broadway musical, and instead, Reeve's band was the musical's band, which was kind of cool. Tony nominee Jennifer Damiano, Tony nominee and voice of Satan in Hell of a Boss, Mr. Patrick Page, Across the Universe actress TV Carpio, Law and Order actor Michael Mulheron, Tony-nominated actress Isabel Keating, musical theater actor Jeb Brown, and Matt Kaplan as the school bully Flash Thompson. Now, due to the physical demands of the role, Carney performed in 6 of the 8 performances each week, with his alternate understudy being British actor Matthew James Thomas, who would eventually leave the production in 2012 to star in the revival of Pippin. Now, based on everything that unfolded during the production, the role of Spider Man himself was arguably one of the most physically demanding and dangerous roles in modern Broadway history. Why? Well, it was because a role that went far beyond the typical demands of a lead actor. The role was so physically intense that Reeve Carney had an understudy, Matthew James Thomas, who wasn't just there for when Carney was sick. Thomas performed in 2 of the 8 shows a week from the start, a practice virtually unheard of for a leading man in a major musical. This was a clear acknowledgement by the creative team and producers of the immense physical strain that the role would put on any single performer. Okay, so the most demanding aspect was the sheer volume of high-risk aerial work. The actor playing Spider-Man was responsible for executing 27 separate flying sequences, which involved complex choreography, high-speed travel across the stage and over the audience, and staged aerial combat. This also required the lead to be both a skilled actor and a trained aerial stunt performer, all while singing and acting at the same time. So let's put a short pause on what we know so far. The production as a whole cost about $65 million, with the show's unusually high running costs reported to be about $1 million per week. Now, guys, to put that $65 million production cost into perspective, the average cost for a big Broadway musical is typically in the $10 million to $15 million range. That pretty much made Spider-Man more than 4 times more expensive than a standard blockbuster musical. But the really jaw-dropping number was the weekly running cost, a reported $1 million per week. Now, most successful shows on Broadway, even huge spectacles like Wicked or The Lion King, have weekly costs that are a fraction of that number. Well, what this meant was that every single week the show was in previews, which we know was for a very, very long time, with a constantly changing script and a team trying to fix its problems. It basically had to make $1 million just to break even. It was like a giant public and incredibly expensive clock ticking down. It's an immense financial burden that no other show had ever faced, and it's the reason why the drama felt so high stakes. Now, if you thought all of that, what I just talked about, was all the drama that this production saw, oh, think again. Buckle up. 6 people were injured while working on Spider-Man. After 2 stunt doubles were injured during various flying sequences and rehearsals, safety inspectors from the New York State Department of Labor reviewed those scenes in the show, and in February of 2011 cited the show for 2 workplace safety violations. Okay, so I mean, sometimes this happens. Well, then the United States Occupational Safety and Health Administration fined the show $12,600 in March of 2011 for 3 very serious safety violations. Then, the Actors Equity Association also looked into the incidents. What basically happened here was a major public safety crisis that went far beyond what typically happens in a Broadway production. This was not a case of a minor one-off incident. It was a clear pattern of serious accidents that drew the attention of federal and state authorities. Minor injuries or technical hiccups can and do occur during the development of a stage show. However, the severity and frequency of the Spider-Man accidents, including stunt doubles falling from heights and multiple actors being seriously hurt, triggered a level of external oversight that is almost unheard of today in theater. Now, the involvement of the New York State Department of Labor, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, also known as OSHA, and the Actors Equity Association meant that the show's creative problems had now become both legal and labor problems. Oh, where does it end? The citations and fines from OSHA and the investigations by Actors Equity were a formal acknowledgement that the show's ambitious stunts were being performed without adequate safety measures, basically putting immense pressure on the production to not only fix its creative issues, but to completely re-engineer its technical and safety procedures, all while under intense public scrutiny and facing a massive financial burn rate. It basically transformed the behind the scenes drama into a very real and dangerous situation. Now, you all may be thinking, okay, it's not anything major though. Okay, let's discuss this. So, Natalie Mendoza, who was originally cast as Arachne, suffered a concussion during the first preview performance when she was struck in the head by equipment in the wings. Now, she actually didn't report the accident to producers until November 30th. Ah, red flag number one. She appeared in the second performance against her doctor's advice, and the role basically involves several flying sequences, including one in which she is spun upside down. Red flag number two. Now, in the theater world, especially on Broadway, there's a powerful culture of the show must go on. The production had already experienced delays and injuries. The cast and crew were under immense pressure from producers, investors, and the public to get the show on its feet. Reporting an injury, even a serious one like a concussion, could be seen as jeopardizing the entire project, especially for a new show that was already under so much scrutiny. In a cast with alternates and understudies, actors know there's someone ready to step into their role at any moment. However, for a star like Mendoza, there would have been an incredible amount of pressure to prove she was up to the physical demands of the role. Stepping back for a concussion, particularly one that wasn't immediately visible, could have potentially put her in a position to be replaced permanently. Now, many performers have a deeply ingrained sense of dedication to their craft and their castmates. They push through pain and injury for their art, a mentality that is often praised as being tough or resilient. However, in this case, that instinct combined with the extreme pressure led to a choice that put her at even greater risk. She would, however, eventually withdraw from the production due to, and here's where it finally clicked for her, when she returned to the production on December 15th, Spider-Man's stunt performer Christopher Tierney was injured and hospitalized, so she suspended her performance. Now, both times she was filled in by her understudy, but the second time was the final click for her. Now, about Christopher Tierney in that preview performance. Tierney basically fell 21 feet, basically 6.4 meters, off a piece of scenery when his harness was not connected to the safety cord, leaving him to free fall through the stage and into the orchestra pit. Now, the injury to Christopher Tierney was a defining moment in the public drama of the production, moving the conversation from creative struggles to a very serious issue of life-threatening safety. Tierney was a stunt double for the lead, and his fall during a preview performance was a terrifying incident. He basically fell through the stage's trap door and into the orchestra pit, an area that, well, below the stage is not typically designed to break a person's fall. The fall, however, was seen by a full theater audience, and the show was immediately stopped. This was not a simple bruise or a sprained ankle. Tierney suffered multiple serious injuries, including a fractured elbow, a broken sacrum, a broken shoulder blade, 4 broken ribs, and 3 fractured vertebrae. Now, the incident led to an immediate shutdown of the show by the Department of Labor, which launched an investigation. Now, for the public, this was the moment when the rock and roll circus became a genuinely safety hazard, and it only added to the show's reputation for being a total disaster. The fact that Tierney would later return to the show was a remarkable turn of events that further cemented his place in the production's infamous history. Now, throughout all of this packed drama came the critics. The show's first performance on November 28th of 2010 garnered what was most likely the most press coverage of a first preview in Broadway history. Although reviews during the preview period are unusual, the critics decided that the ever-expanding preview period, which was super long, and the fact that the ticket prices were so excruciatingly high, that they should not wait for the official opening to submit their reviews. Oh boy, here we go. Author Daniel Mendelsohn followed up the complaints of other critics that Taymor's attempt to graft the classical myth of Arachne onto the comic book story turned the show into a grotesque hybrid and overloaded the plot with 2 unrelated main villains in Arachne and the Green Goblin. Mendelssohn saw a crucial difference between the ancient models of human to animal metamorphosis. For today's audiences, such transformations are liberating, literally empowering, whereas for the ancients, they were more than not humiliations, punishments for inappropriate or overweening behavior. At the heart of Spider Man disaster is the essential incompatibility of those two visions of physical transformation, the ancient and the modern, the redemptive and the punitive, visions that Tamor tried, heroically but futilely, to reconcile. And the New York Times critic Ben Brantley said that the Spider Man may rank among the worst of the Broadway musicals. In his review of the revised version, Brantley wrote, "So this ascent from jaw-dropping badness to mere mediocrity, a step upward? Well, until last weekend, I would have recommended Spider-Man only to carrion-feasting theater vultures. Now, if I knew a less than precocious child of age 10 or so, and had several $100s to throw away, I would consider taking him or her to the new and improved Spider-Man." Despite mostly negative, though, Spider-Man was at times successful at the box office. The New York Times' Patrick Healy stated in February of 2011 that Spider-Man had become a national object of pop culture fascination, more so perhaps than any show in Broadway history due to media coverage and late-night comedians' monologues on the musical's many delays, injuries, and creative issues. He speculated that the musical would not have staying power right through repeat viewings like other hit musicals, after tourists and parents with children watched it for bragging rights at dinner parties or on the playground. Spider-Man survived beyond September of 2011, with ticket sales improving during the summer. Now, about half of its audience came from beyond the New York metropolitan area, including many foreign tourists. In November, its producers stated that the show earned about $100,000 to $300,000 in net income each week, which meant that Spider-Man would have had to continue playing for at least 5 years to recoup the $75 million cost. Producers discussed adding new scenes and perhaps a new song each year to persuade fans to attend it again and again as a whole new comic book issue. Now, guys, for a producer, the goal is not just to open a show, but for it to recoup or pay back its initial investment. The idea that it would take 5 years to recoup is incredibly long for a Broadway production. Most producers hope to recoup this within a year or two, and a show that takes 5 years to pay off its debt is an anomaly. The idea of adding new scenes and perhaps a new song each year to turn it into a live comic book was a Hail Mary pass. In reality, this was likely not a viable option for several key reasons. One, a weekly running cost of $1 million is not sustainable for any length of time. The show basically had to be a blockbuster hit every single week just to break even, leaving no room for dips in ticket sales due to holidays, bad weather, or general shifts in tourist traffic. Two, theatergoers don't typically reattend a musical every year in the same way that they might buy a new comic book or go to the movies. Now, while a few dedicated fans might have returned, the vast majority of the audience is seeing the show for the first time. The show's reputation for being chaotic and dangerous would have made it an incredibly hard sell to a repeat audience. And three, adding new scenes and songs annually would require constant rehearsals, new technical installations, and new contracts for the cast and crew. This would then add to the already insane weekly running cost and turn the production into a perpetual state of flux, making it impossible to actually run smoothly. So, in essence, this was a desperate plan to find a new model to justify the show's existence and astronomical costs. It was a creative idea, but it was a fantasy that did not align with the economic realities of Broadway. So, what was all this talk of a revised work aptly named Spider-Man 2.0? Ah, well, the name perfectly captured what it was led to be. After all the drama, the injuries, the bad press, and the departure of the original director, the producers and the new creative team had to do something drastic. They couldn't just keep the show as it was. So, Spider-Man 2.0 was the completely overhaul, reimagined version of the musical that went into effect during its preview run. Now, this wasn't a tweak, it was a total creative and technical reboot. The core goal was to fix the show's biggest problems: the incomprehensible plot, the slow pace, and most importantly, the life-threatening safety issues. Now, the new creative team, led by Philip McKinley and Roberto Sarcosa, essentially threw out the original, complex mythological plot involving Arachne as a central villain. The story was then streamlined to focus more on the classic Spider-Man origin story that audiences were familiar with from the comics and films. It was less of a pop art opera and more of a recognizable Broadway musical. Now, large portions of the script were rewritten to make the narrative easier to follow. The Greek chorus of four teenagers was either cut or changed, and the entire show was repaced to be more dynamic. The most critical change was, though, to the aerial sequences. The show was shut down for several weeks so the flying effects and choreography could be completely reimagined and retested to make them safer for the cast and stunt doubles. This was a non-negotiable step after the OSHA fines and the public scrutiny. Essentially, Spider-Man 2.0 was the final attempt to salvage a project that had become a public punchline. It was a last-ditch effort to turn a chaotic experimental show into a commercially viable and safe Broadway spectacle. And, in a way, it actually worked. This revised version is the only one that officially opened in June of 2011 and went on to have a respectable run of over 1,000 performances, finally shaking off some of its early infamous reputation. However, in November of 2013, producers announced that the show would close on January 4th of 2014, citing failing ticket sales and no longer being able to get injury insurance for the production as reasons for closure. Having been on Broadway for over 3 years, the production failed to make back its $75 million cost. No kidding. The largest in Broadway history, with investors reportedly losing up to $60 million. Now, from a purely financial standpoint, the show was an undeniable and unavoidable failure from the start. The $75 million investment was simply too large to ever be recouped, especially with weekly running costs that were triple the Broadway norm. The producer's fantasy of making it a 5-year venture was just that, a fantasy. The massive debt was an unsurmountable burden, and the show was always fighting a losing battle against the numbers. The fact that it lost $60 million is a clear sign that the business model was broken from day one. However, from a creative and a theatrical standpoint, Spider-Man 2.0 was basically a success. The revised show was a massive improvement over the chaotic original. The plot was simplified, the songs were reordered, and most importantly, the safety issues were addressed. It went from being a dangerous, incomprehensible mess to a coherent, albeit still very expensive, Broadway spectacle. This is why it was able to run for over 3 years and perform over 1,000 shows. An immediate complete failure would have closed within weeks, not years. So, while Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark was ultimately one of the biggest financial flops in Broadway history, the 2.0 revision successfully redeemed the show's reputation and proved that with a lot of effort, it was possible to create a show that audiences could enjoy and that could run for a significant period of time. In all, guys, the show's $75 million price tag set a record that is unlikely to ever be broken. It serves as a permanent, powerful warning to producers and investors about the risks of unchecked ambition and a runaway budget. Before Spider-Man, a few shows were considered risky and expensive, but this one took it to a new, breathtaking level. It showed that even with a popular brand like Spider-Man and a world-famous names like Bono and The Edge, you can't defy the laws of economics. The show's financial failure made the entire industry reconsider what a show should realistically cost to produce. Now, this also means that the show's most important contribution came from the multiple public injuries and the involvement of OSHA and the Actors Equity Association, leading to an industry-wide reevaluation of safety protocols. For shows with a high degree of technical complexity and aerial stunts, the safety measures and certifications are now much stricter. The show forced the industry to prioritize performer and audience safety over theatrical spectacle, a lesson learned the hard way that what was most likely prevented future accidents. Spider-Man also created a new kind of Broadway publicity cycle. In the age of social media, the show's endless previews and public drama were a constant source of viral headlines, turning the behind-the-scenes chaos into the main event. It pioneered the idea of a production becoming a public spectacle before it had even officially opened. Creatively, it served as a brutal lesson that a big budget and famous names can't substitute for a clear, cohesive vision. The struggle to define the show's genre as a rock opera, a circus, or a drama reflected an identity crisis that was apparent even on the stage. In essence, the legacy of Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark is one of a cautionary tale. It taught Broadway that there are limits to creative risk, financial recklessness, and technical ambition. It may have been a failure in many ways, but a very public and memorable one that forced the industry to learn some invaluable lessons. Hey guys, that's our look at the web-slinging, headline-making, and wallet-draining saga of Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark. Guys, this is a show that taught us that sometimes a superhero's biggest villain isn't a Green Goblin, but an uncooperative harness and a $75 million budget. Thanks for joining us on a Broadway Breakdown, and we'll see you next time, and remember, always check your harness. I mean, web slinger, before you fly.